Before we begin, I just want to say thank you for all the support on the latest video. It genuinely means a lot to see people enjoying these stories and coming back for more. Now, settle in, because the Gryffindor Ledger begins with old promises, hidden records, and a mystery inside Hogwarts that is already darker than it first appears. Gryffindor Ledger, Chapter 1, The Weight of Promises. The third-floor classroom had once held a litter of old desks and one stubborn blackboard. Now it stood nearly bare, floorboards showing through a skin of dust where no boots had troubled them in years. Dumbledore stood in the middle of it, listening to the castle settle around him. Above, a pipe gave a metallic tick. In the corridor beyond the door, a suit of armor shifted and muttered to itself. The room offered little in the way of confession. That was often the trouble with magic after use. It left a scent, a stain, the faint outline of what had been done, then expected gratitude for the favor. He lifted his wand and sent the tracing spell over the boards again. Silver light skimmed the floor in a low ribbon, pooling where two students had stood, then thinning where a third presence had pressed in and withdrawn. The trace was old enough to be elusive and recent enough to keep its habits. Ordinary adolescent magic did not settle so neatly into the grain of wood. Ordinary adolescent magic was noisy, vain, and usually left scorch marks where it ought not. This was different. Dumbledore crouched, his robes whispering through the dust, and touched the wand tip to the place where the light had paused. At once the residue stirred, not with the bright spill of a careless charm, but with a disciplined shiver, as if something had answered a summons it knew. For an instant, the room smelled of hot parchment and candle wax. He drew a slow breath. No one had called the thing by its proper shape in the records room. There had only been the gap in the ledgers, pages cut cleanly away, and the dry note about material transferred to restricted holding, valuation completed elsewhere. A phrase smooth enough to pass through a ministry corridor without raising a murmur. He had seen many such phrases. They were always tidier than the truth. The residue pulsed again, and he felt the answer in his bones before the spell named it. Witnessed. Intent made explicit. An object of loyalty or service or silence. A bond observed, accepted, and given weight by something outside the students who had thought they were speaking only to one another. He straightened. So, not a school prank. Not merely the sort of pledge young people made in a drafty room because they were lonely, frightened, or in love, and imagined the world kind enough to forget it by morning. Hogwarts had always bred vows. Boys swore to one another over stolen sweets, girls exchanged promises by the lake, and every year a few earnest souls made themselves solemn for a fortnight before breaking their resolutions over pumpkin pasties. Messy, mostly harmless. This had a different texture. There was a seam in it. He walked the room with his wand held low, stopping where the boards changed color by a shade no one else would have noticed. The magic had been handled by someone who knew what to listen for. It had not simply been cast, but recorded in the fibers of the act, as though the vow had expected an audience. Around the central point of the trace, the air held a tiny resistance, like fine wire stretched through a curtain. Dumbledore's mouth tightened. For a few necessary minutes, he had allowed himself the hope that the matter might prove vulgar in the old-school way. A quarrel, a foolish promise, a boy's overblown devotion, then tears, remorse, and the usual embarrassment. There would still have been trouble, but of a kind one could manage with tea, tact, and a severe look at the worst offenders. This was not that. The castle had not shouted. It never did. Hogwarts preferred hints, corners, and the odd locked door. But it had given him this much, and he trusted it enough to be uneasy. He knelt again and brushed aside a line of dust. Beneath it, where the wood had darkened in a circle no wider than a saucer, a faint mark remained. Not a rune, not anything so crude as a sigil, but the impression left when a magical structure had been pressed into place repeatedly and with intent. He brought his wand near it, and the residue answered at once, cooling rather than warming, as if the room had recognized an outside authority and resented it. An external framework, then, not a mere school charm, not even a clever one. a system waiting to receive the thing and make it count. He sat back on his heels, the hem of his robe gathering dust. Age had its uses. One became less eager to lurch towards conclusions simply because one had seen too many prove wrong. He would not alarm the staff. Not yet. Minerva would go straight-backed and demand names within the first minute. Pomona would be offended on principle. Phileas would want the theory in triplicate before luncheon. Hagrid would try to batter the problem into a more honest shape, which, while admirable, was not subtle. And whoever had begun this business would be listening for alarm. That too had its own smell. Fear made people tidy. He rose and crossed to the window. Evening grayed the glass. Beyond it, the grounds lay flattened under damp weather. A rain cloud hung over the lake, low and bruised. In the reflection he saw himself, bent a little more than he liked, silver beard neat against his robes, looking for all the world like a harmless old gentleman with a taste for peculiar sweets. It was a comforting image for other people. Occasionally, he even believed it. He turned back to the room and let one final charm settle over the floor, not to conceal the traces, but to preserve them. Whatever else happened, he would not have the evidence go stale before he had finished with it. A knock sounded from the corridor. Not loud. 3 measured taps on the wood, the kind of politeness that invited suspicion. Dumbledore looked up at once. A pause followed, then the handle dipped, as though the person outside had considered flight and thought better of it. He crossed the room and opened the door. Argus Filch stood there with Mrs. Norris wound round his ankles like a stripy rope. His face looked carved from old boot leather and bad opinions. In one hand he held a lantern, though the corridor was bright enough without it. "Headmaster," Filch said, peering past him into the classroom as if expecting to find a gang of culprits still smoking. "Someone's been at the east stair. Left a mark on the wall." Dumbledore kept his voice mild. How thoughtful of them to announce it. Filch did not smile. "No students, I don't reckon. Too careful. Cat found it first. I came to tell you before they got clear." Mrs. Norris gave a thin, censorious mew and fixed Dumbledore's shoes with yellow eyes. A mark on the wall. Too careful. Another thread, tugged almost at once. Whoever was moving through his castle tonight was either hurried or confident, and he cared for neither possibility. "Thank you, Mr. Filch," Dumbledore said. "Would you be so kind as to show me?" Filch's eyes narrowed a fraction, which was about as much trust as he granted anyone. "You're coming now?" "Yes, now." The caretaker grunted and turned, lantern swinging. Dumbledore drew the classroom door nearly shut, then rested his fingers for a moment against the wood. Inside, the preserved residue pressed at the air, as if it disliked being left unwatched. "So do I," he murmured. Filch glanced back. "Beg pardon?" "Nothing of consequence," said Dumbledore, and followed him into the corridor. The castle's draft caught at his sleeves as they moved towards the east stair, Mrs. Norris trotting ahead with her tail held high like an accusation. The passages were emptier than they ought to have been at that hour. Sound carried oddly. Twice Dumbledore thought he heard footsteps ahead of them, and twice it proved to be water in the pipes or the sulky shift of a portrait frame. Filch stopped at the turn by the east stair and lifted the lantern. "There," he said. At first, Dumbledore saw only old stone, damp in the joints and worn smooth where generations of hands had steadied themselves on the climb. Then the light caught a dull crescent on the wall at shoulder height. Not carved, not painted. A pressure mark, as if something had rested there for a moment and been removed with care. He stepped closer. The residue answered before he touched it. Coolness spread over his knuckles, followed by that same disciplined shiver he had felt in the classroom. Hot parchment, candle wax, and beneath both, the faint metallic tang of magic made to travel. His expression did not change, but the last of his hope went out. Not a separate mischief, then? The same hand, or one trained by it. The same framework reaching beyond one hidden room and into the arteries of the castle. The east stair mark was not the instrument itself, but a point of passage, a place where the structure had been braced, tested, or received. Filch watched him sidelong. Bad, is it? Yes, said Dumbledore, because anything softer would have been a lie. The caretaker's mouth flattened. Shall I fetch Professor McGonagall? Not yet. Dumbledore laid 2 fingers against the stone and cast a preserving charm akin to the one in the classroom. The mark dimmed, then held. For tonight, I want this stair kept empty if you can manage it. No polishing, no scrubbing, no curious prefects. If anyone asks, tell them the wall is unsound and likely to shed mortar on their heads. Filch gave him a look of grudging approval. That I can do. I thought you might. Mrs. Norris sniffed at the base of the wall, then turned her head sharply towards the stairs above. Her back rose in a narrow arch. Dumbledore followed her gaze. Nothing moved there but shadow. Even so, the skin at the back of his neck tightened. Someone had been here recently enough to leave the magic unsettled, and recently enough, perhaps, to wonder whether it had been found. He lowered his wand. Mr. Filch, walk with me to the landing. Filch did not ask why. They climbed a few steps together, lantern light rocking over stone. At the first landing, Dumbledore paused and listened. Far off, a door shut. Closer by, a portrait snored. No retreating feet, no breath held just out of sight. Only the castle, keeping its counsel. The records room smelled of old paper, damp stone, and the sort of secrecy that outlives the people who arrange it. It was colder than the corridor outside. Tall presses stood in 2 rows beneath the windows, their brass labels dulled to a tired brown. Between them, narrow ladders ran on rails that gave a faint metallic shiver when touched, as if even the furniture disliked inquiry. Dumbledore set the first ledger on the table and rested his hand on its cracked leather cover. Hagrid hovered at his shoulder, ducking beneath the lowest shelf, which had been built for ordinary men and had never been persuaded to apologize for it. "'Tain't much to look at," Hagrid muttered, keeping his voice low. Dust still drifted in the lamplight. "If there's summit in here, it'll be buried rotten deep." "That is usually where inconvenient things prefer to live," said Dumbledore. He opened the ledger to the marked page. The lines had been ruled by a careful hand, then crossed through by another that had tried hard to look temporary. Names, dates, houses, school matters so drab they invited neglect. Then, every few pages, a gap where a date should have been, or a leaf removed so neatly the knife had done its work with professional courtesy. Hagrid leaned nearer. Why'd anyone cut pages out of school records? Because paper can be persuasive in the wrong hands, Dumbledore said. He turned another page. The entries stopped halfway through a term for 6 weeks. The next surviving line resumed in the same hand with no explanation, only a note in the margin. Transferred to temporary holding. He read it twice, then a third time. His expression did not alter. The skin between his shoulders tightened. He had seen this shape before. Not these names, not these dates, but this shape. Wartime euphemism, administrative tidiness, children converted into matters of process. Records moved just far enough that respectable people could stop asking where they had gone. Hagrid scratched at his beard. Could be they got shifted when some other lot was put by. Old books move all the time. Yes, said Dumbledore. Books do. He closed the ledger and took up the second. This one was smaller, with a lock that had once been silver and was now the color of bad weather. The charm on it gave way under his thumb with a tired little snap. Whoever had sealed it had expected obedience, not patience. Inside were index slips. Most were blank. Some bore only initials, house marks, and narrow columns for appraisal. Reliability, duration, scope. The neatness of it turned his stomach. He paused over one slip, then another. The entries had been removed, but not so cleanly that the paper had forgotten them. A pressure shadow remained where ink had once lain, faint as a bruise. Professor? Dumbledore looked up. Hagrid wore the uneasy, apologetic look of a man who suspected he had already understood more than he ought. Did you know oaths could be, well, filed? Hagrid asked. Properly, I mean, not just promises. I've heard of school promises, prefects and all that. But not like this. I had begun to suspect as much, said Dumbledore. Hagrid frowned at the slips. That ain't right, is it? No, said Dumbledore. The word was soft. Hagrid stopped fidgeting. Dumbledore returned the slip to its place. The room seemed to listen. There had been another gap once. In a decade no one mentioned without first deciding how brave they felt. Another during the later months of the last war, when young people had been induced to make solemn noises in broom cupboards and under staircases, and told that duty was noble, provided someone else collected the cost. The pattern here was not exact. It never was. But the edges were the same, something copied out of one ledger and laid over another until absence itself became policy. He moved to the next shelf. The drawers had been arranged by some long-dead clerk who had believed order could outwit theft. Most were ordinary enough: discipline, permissions, governor's correspondence. Then, near the bottom, a whole run of years was missing together. Not misfiled, not lost. Removed. Dumbledore stood still. In the window, the late light turned the dust gold for a moment, then let it go gray again. Hagrid shifted his weight. If you're looking for old-school business, I can ask round. Folk talk to me. Not always when they should, but they do. That is precisely why I value you, said Dumbledore. Hagrid brightened, then looked wary, as though praise might be the prelude to caution. He was loyal in the broad, unguarded way of a great dog, excellent at guarding a door, less excellent at concealing that he had been told to guard it. Only, Hagrid said, if it's serious, maybe I ought to tell Professor McGonagall. She's got a better head for records than me. Eventually, said Dumbledore, not at once. Hagrid nodded, though not happily. A soft tap sounded at the door. Dumbledore looked up. The second tap came precise and discreet. No student knocked so politely. Filch would have kicked. I'll get it, said Hagrid. No, Dumbledore said at once. Hagrid stopped. The word had come out sharper than intended. Dumbledore gentled it before the room could keep score. No need. I expect it is for me. He crossed to the door and opened it a hand's breadth. An owl packet, sealed in dark green wax, was passed through by a corridor hand he did not see. The bird itself had already gone. Hagrid took the bundle with a puzzled grunt and handed it over. From Hogsmeade, he said. Looks official-ish. That last word was not encouraging. Dumbledore broke the seal. The stamp was unfamiliar in detail, familiar in intent. Not ministry. Not school. Something adjacent to both and therefore harder to challenge cleanly. He unfolded the notice and read without changing his face. Hagrid peered. What is it? Nothing you need trouble yourself over. That sounds like trouble. It often is. The notice was short. Too short, which made it worse. It gave a reference number, a date 2 days old, and a statement that a student-linked obligation had been appraised through the Hogsmeade Gringotts Annex. Confirmation was requested under standing valuation. No name appeared in the body of the notice, only a coded mark in the margin and a second stamp over the lower corner, as though too many careful hands had already touched it. Dumbledore read the line again, then once more. The wording matched the older slips in the drawer. More than that, it matched a category rather than a person. An obligation acknowledged as active, assessed as transferable only under restricted authority, and flagged for immediate review if the subject remained under school protection. Recognition first, valuation second. A promise made large enough to be counted, a child's bond treated as if it were property. So, not merely old records disturbed, not merely some scavenger rummaging in dead procedures. Someone had found a living channel and put it to use, recently enough to expect an answer. His immediate course became unpleasantly clear. He folded the notice with exact care and slipped it into the inner pocket of his robes. Hagrid was watching him with open concern. Well? Someone has been industrious, said Dumbledore. In the bad way? In the expensive one. That earned him a baffled frown. Hagrid worried at his beard. Is it one of the students? I have not yet decided whether that is a question I ought to answer for you. Hagrid's mouth opened, shut, then opened again. "I don't go blabbing everything." "No," Dumbledore said gently. "You merely remember things aloud." Hagrid huffed, stung because it was true. "Well, I can keep this room shut," he said, "and I can ask the house elves if anyone's been snooping. They see everything, don't they? Sometimes more than we would like." Dumbledore laid his hand on the missing year's drawer, then withdrew it. There were only two useful responses now: widen the circle or narrow it at once. One invited speed and risk, the other delay and control. He had spent too much of his life choosing between harms to pretend either was clean. "Hagrid," he said, "I want you to do something for me, and I need you to do it exactly as I ask." Hagrid straightened. "Of course." "Look into anything recent in the school records that concerns permissions, signatures, or unusual sponsoring arrangements. Nothing older than this term. Nothing outside your ordinary duties. If anyone asks, you are helping me sort an administrative muddle." Hagrid blinked. "That's it? That is enough for tonight." "Right," Hagrid said slowly, disappointment flickering across his face. He had expected danger with teeth. He had been handed paper instead. "And if I find summit, then you bring it to me alone, at once." "Right," Hagrid repeated, firmer now. Dumbledore inclined his head. "And Hagrid, speak to no one of Hogsmeade, annexes, appraisals, or notices with green seals. Not Professor McGonagall, not the house elves, not a portrait, not even Fang." Hagrid gave a reluctant snort. "I know how to keep shut." "I know you do," said Dumbledore. "I also know how heavily silence sits on you, and I would spare you carrying more of it than necessary." That landed. Hagrid's broad face changed, the injured look fading into something graver. "It's bad, then." "Yes," said Dumbledore. "And it is now." He moved past Hagrid to the door, already measuring the next steps. The annex must be approached, but not by Owl. The records here must be secured before dawn, and the student at the center of the notice must be watched without ever knowing why. Whoever had sent that appraisal request believed the matter could still be converted, transferred, claimed. They were wrong. "Hagrid," he said, his hand on the latch. "Lock this room after me." Chapter 2. Terms and Beneficiaries. The restricted stacks kept a different silence from the rest of the library. Not the peace of a chapel, nor the honest hush of sleeping boys, but the taut, papery quiet of things shut away and aware of it. Dust lay in the pleats of the high curtains. Lamps over the reading tables burned a steady honey gold, catching on brass corners and turning the green baize of the desks the color of old moss. Dumbledore stood behind a double row of atlases and did not move. From the aisle, he would have been no more than another vertical shadow among the shelves, perhaps a trick of the light, perhaps a professor who had forgotten himself into stillness. The castle allowed such ambiguities. The library encouraged them. At the far table, one student had a heavy volume spread flat beneath both hands, forearm braced across the pages, as he read with the kind of concentration that set his mouth hard. The other had a narrower book propped against a stack of notes, a quill tucked behind one ear, ink dark on her fingers, though she had not written for several minutes. Between them lay a row of borrowed texts, two authorized by Dumbledore himself, and one obtained only after an argument with Madame Pince that had cost him a fresh pair of gloves and, regrettably, a tin of lemon drops. The boy turned a page with exaggerated care. It rasped in the stillness. "Look at this bit again," he said. The girl bent over, hair slipping forward. "I am looking at it. No, properly, this line." The sentence itself was hidden from Dumbledore by the angle of the book, but the tone told him enough. This was no idle curiosity. They had the charged alertness of people who had found a loose stone underfoot and were testing whether the floor beneath it was hollow. The girl read in silence, lips moving once over the line. Then she set down her quill. "Yes," she said, "that is the point." The boy made a small sound. "But that would mean the words and the authority can be separated." "Not the words," she said at once. "The enforceable part. The words remain the words. The question is who gets to call them in. Dumbledore let one hand rest against the shelf beside him. The wood felt cool through his sleeve. He had known they were clever. He had expected, in truth, that they might be clever in exactly this direction. Even so, hearing them arrive there unaided gave him a jolt, like setting a foot on a stair and finding it lower than it ought to be. The boy frowned at the page. So if a promise says one thing, and the benefit from it gets assigned to someone else, the promise itself doesn't change, but the control does. Yes, she said, and that is the danger. The text can look tidy enough for a court while the practical power goes elsewhere. Her voice was clipped and even, but not calm. Strain ran beneath it, the strain of thinking too quickly for comfort and seeing no harmless answer ahead. Dumbledore traced a finger along the shelf label at his side as though his attention were on the index number. His thoughts moved with it. They were no longer asking whether there had been some irregularity in the school's promise records. They were asking how the irregularity worked. The boy leaned back, making his chair creak. That's rotten. The girl looked at him over the top of the book. That is not a useful classification. It is to me. Yes, I had gathered that. He gave a brief huff of laughter, then checked himself when a nearby portrait shifted in its frame with a dry rustle, affronted by the suggestion that standards existed at all. The painted witch inside opened one eye, found nothing worth reporting, and returned to sleep with immense dignity. Dumbledore did not smile. He listened. Pages turned. One book thudded shut. Another was dragged from the stack with a grunt of effort. For an instant its spine showed. An old legal compendium, the sort whose index was more serviceable than its prose. The girl opened to a marked section and ran a forefinger down the lines. Here, she said. See? The obligation can be held apart from the beneficiary interest if the witness and the registration are proper. Held apart by whom? By the office that records it. That sounds vile. It is not meant to sound pleasant. He was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore shifted his weight by no more than a breath. Beneficiary interest. They were not reading about oaths as piety, punishment, or schoolboy melodrama dressed in legal language. They had reached the hinge itself. A thing could be bound in one direction and enjoyed in another. A promise could be one thing in the mouth and another in the ledger. The child who spoke the words might bear the burden, while the lawful advantage traveled elsewhere in respectable shoes. They had found the mechanism. A brief, inconvenient warmth moved through his chest. Not pride, not relief. Something older and less forgivable. The ache of recognizing that children had been forced to grow sharp in order to survive what adults had arranged. The girl looked up then, her gaze passing over the shelves without seeing him, as if the room itself might answer her. If they can separate control from wording, she said, then the question is not whether the oath is real. It is who has the right to use it. The boy stared at her. You think someone can own the use of it? I think someone already does. No triumph touched the words, only the flat, unwilling weight of a conclusion. Dumbledore closed his eyes for the space of 2 heartbeats, not long enough for regret to become indulgence. The boy scrubbed both hands through his hair and glared at the ceiling. That is an appalling sentence. Yes, she said, it is also the problem. He bent over the book again, though he was no longer reading so much as worrying at the idea. His finger tapped the margin. If the wording stays valid and the control is assigned, then breaking the wording won't fix it. Not if the assignment survives. Survives where? In the records, in the authority, wherever they keep the benefit. Dumbledore's gaze moved along the shelves. Restricted books sat with their backs turned, as if they had done nothing more dangerous than gather dust. Some held fragments, some half-truths, some poison wrapped in proper citations. All were useful to someone. That was the trouble with books. They were innocent of the uses to which they were put. The boy reached for another volume and drew it towards him. Its spine was cracked. Faded gilt flaked beneath his thumb. He opened it with the care of someone who had already learned that old books punished clumsy hands. The girl leaned in, shoulder nearly touching his, both intent on the same page. Dumbledore caught the heading before the angle took it from him. Transfers, standing, lawful witnesses. A chapter that had no business in a school library, except that schools, like governments, were forever made to house what ought not be housed. The boy read under his breath, shaping the terms without voicing them. Then he stopped and looked sideways at the girl. That means the person who made it may not be the one who benefits. Yes. Even if they thought they were promising something else. Especially then. He sat back slowly. Merlin. A brittle sound escaped her, almost a laugh. Do not start invoking him now. He is probably busy. Dumbledore's mouth twitched despite himself, though the amusement died quickly. They were close enough now that the air seemed thinner. He could intervene with a cough, a question, some harmless remark about overdue returns. He could send them away before they found the wrong name for the right machinery. But a warning offered too soon would teach them only that the shelves had ears. Then they would stop reading in the open. They would retreat to private rooms, to whispers, to portraits and scraps and half-trusted confidences. He would lose sight of the shape of their thought, and secrecy, once invited, was a diligent host. No, better to let them proceed and measure what they could reach. The girl pulled the quill from behind her ear and made 3 quick notes on her parchment. We need the registration trail. The boy's brow furrowed. If we ask for that, they'll know what we're looking for. They may already know. That is not comforting. It was not intended to be. He gave her a look that in another room might have passed for scandal. Here, it was merely deserved. Then he reached again for the heavy book, but his fingers hesitated on the cover. The book tilted into the lamplight, and the page gave a soft crack as it bent against his grip. The girl put out a hand to steady it, and both of them bent lower over the same narrow column of print. Then the boy went still. What? She whispered. He did not answer at once. His finger had stopped halfway down the page. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that Dumbledore had to lean his attention towards it. It says the registration may be entered by proxy. The girl's hand tightened on the edge of the book. Read the rest. He swallowed and did so, more silently than before. Dumbledore could not make out the words, only the shape of the moment as it landed between them. The girl's face changed first, not surprise exactly, but the hardening of fear into form. Oh, she said. The boy looked up. So whoever arranged it wouldn't need to appear in person? No, she said, only to have standing. A pause opened. That narrows nothing, he said. It narrows one thing. She tapped the page once. It means this was organized, deliberately, not inherited by accident, not left lying about for someone to stumble into. Someone built a way for the benefit to move. He stared at her, and for the first time that evening his indignation gave way to something colder. Then we are not dealing with a loophole. No, she said. We are dealing with a design. The words settled in the restricted quiet like a stone dropped into deep water. Behind the atlases, Dumbledore felt the old, familiar chill of a board shifting under the game. They had not found proof, not yet, but they had found intent. The lake had gone the color of pewter by the time Dumbledore reached the shore, and the first cold of evening had crept down from the hills to settle under the trees. Reeds rasped at the water's edge. A pair of ducks, unimpressed by war, drifted beyond the dark band of the far bank. He stood where the grass gave way to mud and watched the 2 students below the slope. They had chosen a little hollow beside the path, half hidden by a thorn bush gone pale and twiggy with the season. From here, with the lake behind them and the castle rising above, they looked smaller than they had in the stacks, more ordinary, and therefore more exposed. Trouble often preferred to begin that way, not with a blaze, but with 2 children talking too close to the water. One of them held a parcel wrapped in brown paper, not opened now, merely turned over in both hands as if its weight might explain itself. The other kept one shoulder forward, guarding the book under their arm from a blow that had not yet come. There had been an argument before Dumbledore arrived. He could see it in the set of their feet, in the way one stood square while the other angled away by a fraction, close enough to continue, far enough to retreat. A bird crossed the pale sky overhead, then another, lower. Dumbledore looked up on instinct and saw only the turn of wings against cloud. Nothing remarkable. One owl on its ordinary route would not have been worth a second glance. Now the pair spoke again, and the words came to him in fragments, broken by the wind. "I am not asking you to hand it over," said the voice he could hear more clearly, tense and dry. "I am asking you to say what it says. And I am saying I don't like reading somebody else's correspondence over a lake." "You read it already." "That is not the point." The breeze moved across the shore, carrying the smell of weed and wet stone. Dumbledore remained still. Stillness was rarely comfortable. It was simply the only way to keep from intruding where one had no business. The opened letter, or what was left of it, flashed white in the student's hand when they turned it. Then the paper was folded over again, hidden against the brown parcel, as if secrecy itself might be made to sit neatly that way. "I don't see why they care so much," the second student said, and there it was, a touch too light, too practiced. "It's only a meeting." The first student answered after a beat. "Nothing is only anything now." The words were plain. They were also, Dumbledore suspected, the sort of plainness that covered a great deal. The war had made everyone speak as if they were balancing crockery on a tray. One careless movement, and the whole thing would smash. The student with the parcel turned sharply, enough for Dumbledore to catch the pale edge of a profile and the quick movement of a hand at the wrist, where some old mark, band, or charm might have been hidden under the cuff. Nothing visible, nothing to prove. Yet the body had its own manners, and it did not often lie as prettily as the mouth. The other student said, "If your home writes again, tell them no." A silence followed, brief but taut. "Would you?" came the reply. It was a small question, almost mild. It landed like a stone. Dumbledore watched the shoulders of the questioner go rigid before the answer came. The second student looked towards the lake rather than at the companion beside them, as if the water offered a safer surface than a face. "Yes," they said at last, "if they were asking that." Not a denial, then, merely a carefully placed stone over a hole. The first student gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's convenient." "It is not convenient. It is what I mean." "Then say it properly." "I am." "No, you are not." Dumbledore's eyes settled on the parcel again. The paper had been rewrapped with such neatness that someone must have done it by habit. A tidy hand, respectable paper. The sort of thing a family might send through an owl and then deny with equal grace if challenged. The student who had first spoken shifted the parcel under one arm and drew the other hand through their hair. A restrained gesture. Frustration, perhaps. Or fear dressed in irritation because that was less embarrassing in front of a friend. The friend, if friend was still the right word, had gone pale around the mouth. Not much. Enough for Dumbledore to notice. "What did they ask you to do?" the first student said. The reply came too quickly. "Nothing." "Don't lie." "I am not lying." "You are omitting, then. That is hardly better." The second student looked away, and for a moment, Dumbledore thought the answer might never come. Then they said, "They asked whether you had spoken to anyone else." That was enough to change the air around them. Even at a distance, Dumbledore felt it, that subtle quickening of magical tension which accompanied alarm in the young and calculation in the old. The first student's grip on the parcel tightened. Their wand hand did not move, which was wiser than if it had. "To anyone else about what?" they asked. The answer did not come at once. When it did, it was so low Dumbledore had to read it from the shape of the mouth more than the sound. "About the valuation." There it was. Not the word itself shouted, not announced for the benefit of any passing owl, but spoken as one might name a fungus in a pantry. Carefully, unwillingly, enough to mark the thing as known. Dumbledore's hand remained folded behind his back. The old scar on his finger pressed against the skin of his palm. He had the absurd, unwelcome impression that the lake had become deeper. The first student took a step back. "You didn't tell me that." "I didn't think it mattered." "That is a lie." "I didn't know it would matter to you." The phrase hung between them, stripped of ornament. It was the sort of sentence that could end a friendship or save one, depending on whether honesty arrived in time to patch the damage. Dumbledore watched the first student's head turn by a fraction, as if they were taking in not merely the words, but the shape of the person saying them. "You knew," they said. "I knew part of it." "Part," repeated the other. "That's your favorite sort of truth, isn't it?" Dumbledore almost smiled, but the expression did not come. The first student had not meant him, and yet the edge of the remark would have done credit to several people he knew. The second student drew a breath through the nose, controlled and thin. "If I had told you earlier, it would have made things worse." "For who?" A pause. That was the trouble, of course. The question had too many answers. Dumbledore studied them both, the one standing with the parcel and the other with the book under the arm. Their shoulders were not touching. Their feet were still placed as if each knew where the other might move next. The alliance was not broken. It had not yet made the horrible little leap from trust to necessity, where one begins to keep secrets in order to protect the other. But it was bending under pressure, and one of them had begun to answer a different set of demands. The owl came then, soundless until it was nearly over the water, a dark shape against the sky. It did not swoop to the students at once. It circled above the shallows, dipped, then turned, and came down on the low branch of a hawthorn near the path, almost exactly where Dumbledore had stood a moment before. Its talons clicked on the bark. A second parchment was tied to its leg, this one narrower, sealed in green wax. Neither student noticed the owl at first. They were too busy looking at one another. Then the first student saw it. They broke off mid-sentence and turned their head too sharply. Dumbledore saw recognition before caution had time to cover it. The student with the parcel stepped forward a fraction, then stopped. The owl ruffled its feathers, annoyed by the pause, and gave a small, impatient snap of its beak. "What is that?" the second student asked. "Nothing," said the first, and the word came too fast to be believed. Dumbledore had his answer, or enough of one to make the next few days dangerous. Whoever wrote from home did not merely ask after the student. They instructed. They watched. They knew enough to press at the exact point where a private promise might be made public, priced, or taken apart. They might know more. They certainly feared more. The child was already looking in the wrong places, and someone had decided to tug the thread before it showed. The owl remained on the branch, head cocked, the green seal catching the last of the light. The path above the shore was edged with stones slick from the lake mist. Dumbledore stepped back into the shadow of the thorn bush and let his hand slide from one branch to the next, already measuring the distance to the castle door and the unseen room where green wax was likely waiting in a drawer. Below him, the second student said, "If you take that, I want to know what it says." The first did not answer. Instead, they moved towards the hawthorn with the careful gait of someone approaching a skittish thing, though whether they feared the bird or the message tied to it was impossible to say. Halfway there, they stopped again and looked back. Even in the failing light, Dumbledore could see the hurt in the line of the body now, no longer hidden under temper. The other student had not followed. They stood where they were, book clamped under one arm, face set in the miserable discipline of someone trying not to beg. "Please," they said. That changed it. Not the facts, the balance. The student by the hawthorn closed their eyes for one brief second, then reached up. The owl submitted with offended dignity, lifting one foot to be untied. The green seal vanished into the student's hand. "Read it here," said the one with the book, and the strain in the voice made the words rougher than anger would have. "If it is nothing, read it here." The other looked at the seal, not breaking it. "If I do, you cannot unknow it. I know enough already." Chapter 3. Market Value. The annex had been built to look respectable in the way an expensive hat looked respectable. Polished brass, dark wood, and the sort of quiet that implied every nuisance had already been dealt with by appointment. Dumbledore stood outside the records suite and watched the wall lamp blur against the frosted glass. Beyond it, a clerk moved in precise silhouette, and somewhere deeper in the annex, a metal mechanism clicked as another armful of ledgers shifted into place. He smoothed his beard, which needed no smoothing, and waited until she had finished stamping a stack of transfer forms. The ink smelled sharp enough to cut bread. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, rising at once. Her smile was correct and small. "You've been admitted to Category 7, Sub-Index B, under ministerial review." "How fortunate," Dumbledore said. "I had feared I might be admitted only to tea and a lecture." Her smile twitched, but held. Better this sort of professionalism than borrowed warmth. Warmth could be performed. Procedure took training. She laid a narrow slate before him. "You may inspect the registered summaries only. No names outside the sealed families remit. No copying charms. No transfiguration of the record surface. If you wish to challenge an entry, the form is blue." "Blue," said Dumbledore. "A reassuring color. It suggests honesty, though usually only in stationery." She answered by reaching for the bell pull. A moment later, the inner door opened by an inch. A goblin's eye appeared first, black and unblinking, then the edge of a hand with long, immaculate nails. "Albus Dumbledore," the goblin said, not as a greeting but as a category. "You may sit. You may not remove anything. If you attempt to charm the ledger, the charm will be noted." "I shall endeavor to disappoint you in other ways," Dumbledore said, and took the offered chair. The vault room was cooler than the corridor, dry with parchment and stone. A slit high in the wall admitted a strip of gray Hogsmeade light, enough to bleach the brass edges of the shelving and leave the corners in shadow. The goblin set 3 bound ledgers on the table between them. Their clasps bore the ministry seal and, beneath it, a second mark Dumbledore did not know and did not like. "These are the general appraisal books," the goblin said. "If you seek an instrument classed as loyalty, service, silence, protection, or obedience, you must specify the region, the sponsoring house, and the date band." "Would it help if I specified innocence?" Dumbledore asked. No. That, at least, was honest. He named the Hogwarts band, the present year, and the broadest, school-linked category he could justify without sounding like a man prepared to accuse the room itself. The goblin touched a crystal stud, and the top ledger opened by itself, its pages sliding with a whisper too delicate for what they held. Columns ran across the page in tight black script. Instrument type, duration, reliability, backing, assessed weight, assignable portion, market band. The words had the polite air of a menu. Dumbledore read the first entries with a calm he did not feel. Family promise, apprenticeship guarantee, house compact. A sponsorship arrangement involving 3 named adults and 1 minor. Then the list shifted, not by much, but enough. Student origin promise, witness confirmed. Duration, academic year. Reliability, moderate. Backing, paternal, maternal, and 1 uncle in good standing. Assessed weight, increased by bloodline guarantee. Assignable portion, 0.6. He did not move. The goblin, perhaps out of justice, did not look up. "Can you tell me," Dumbledore said, "what use is made of the assignable portion?" "If it is not in the public summary, no," said the goblin. "Then perhaps I should be less interested in use and more interested in structure." The goblin's nostrils flared. "Structure is also restricted." Dumbledore turned the page himself, slowly enough that no one could accuse him of haste. More entries. Some bore school references so slight they might have escaped anyone less alert to the smell of rot beneath clean varnish. A prefect obligation, a club initiation oath, a promise of silence made in a corridor after curfew. Each carried a valuation, and each valuation had been adjusted by the same courteous arithmetic. Duration, reliability, bloodline backing, wartime pressure. The figures rose where the war touched them. They rose more when the family was old, more again when the family was frightened. One line caught and held him. Hogwarts linked bundle, wartime band. Combined weight, elevated. Risk offset by multiple student instruments. Transferable share, sealed. He read it again, then a third time, as if repetition might make it kinder. It did not. The bundle includes students? He asked. Linked instruments, said the goblin. That is the term. It is a useful term, Dumbledore said. It keeps one from saying anything vulgar. The goblin's eye narrowed. Vulgarity is not a category recognized here. No, Dumbledore said. Only sale. The goblin laid one claw-tipped finger beside the line without touching it. If you are seeking unlawful trade, you will not find it in a lawful ledger. I am seeking the point at which law becomes convenience, Dumbledore said. For a moment, the goblin only watched him. Then he turned one page further, perhaps because allowing curiosity was easier than answering it. There, in a smaller register, were notes attached to the bundle summaries. Not names, not enough for that, but enough to sting. Cross-reference to school affiliation, reappraised after notice of contest. Wartime sensitivity increased. Hold advised until market pressure settles. Market pressure. The phrase was as clean as a polished counter and twice as ugly. What notice of contest? Dumbledore asked. Privileged record. Privileged records seem to breed in the dark, Dumbledore murmured. One turns over a stone and discovers a whole family. The clerk at the outer desk shifted her quill. The goblin did not smile. You may file a challenge if you have standing. I may also be struck by lightning if I stand in the rain, said Dumbledore. It remains poor advice. He let the ledger lie open and read the figures one by one, committing what he could to memory, then to the tiny scrap of notepaper hidden in the lining of his sleeve. The clerk had seen that he carried no writing materials. She had not seen the older habit. He recorded valuations, bands, modifiers, not names, not yet. There were names somewhere behind all this, he was certain, but the annex had not been foolish enough to hand him the whole list at once. The goblin shut one ledger and drew forward another with a crisp scrape. This one was marked for transfer history, less charitable, more useful. Just the linked category, the goblin said. Do not ask for student roles. Dumbledore gave him a look of mild disappointment, which had often served him better than anger. You underestimate me. I had not intended to ask for all of them. A pause. Then, because the room had already admitted enough unpleasant truths for one afternoon, the goblin opened the real cabinet at the back of the chamber and drew out a narrow silver cylinder. There is also this. It is indexed under wartime adjustments. He set it down. The metal was cold enough to mist Dumbledore's fingertips. The clerk watched from the doorway now, her expression unreadable in the way of people who knew exactly how much they were permitted to know. Dumbledore fitted the reel to the viewing spindle and turned the latch. The first strip of text rolled past in a narrow green glow. He saw the words, high risk, before they vanished. Then continued appraisal. Then wartime note. Demand increased across school-linked instruments. Delay may raise yield. The next line was worse for its calm. Secondary holders to be identified by sealed consent. No challenge entered. No challenge entered. Such a tidy phrase. It made the whole affair sound like weather. He read on until a particular entry, half obscured by the curve of the reel, made him stop. Hogwarts linked bundle, revised. Duration extended by proxy. Reliability strengthened by family signature. Bloodline backing confirmed. Hold for winter market. Winter market. He lifted his eyes from the cylinder and looked, not at the clerk or the goblin, but at the room itself, its brass fittings, its stamped forms, its respectable shelves. There it was. Not proof enough for a charge, perhaps, but enough to tell him what sort of war had been brought into his school. One fought with signatures, guardianship, and timing. Could I have a certified extract of the appraisal columns only? He asked. For which entry band? Said the goblin. Dumbledore looked back down. The strip was still turning. Another notation emerged, then passed under the green light. bundled with school affiliation, waitlisted against conflict rise. Then, at last, the line the damaged copy had swallowed whole came clear. Historical comparator attached. See wartime note, 1943. School-linked holdings perform highest under fear conditions. The skin at the back of his neck tightened. Not new then, not improvised by present panic. Old enough to have precedent. Old enough to have survived one war and learned how to profit from the next. Below it, in smaller script, another note surfaced before the reel could carry it away. Prior challenge withdrawn after headmaster inquiry. He closed his hand over the cylinder. The goblin's gaze sharpened. Professor? For this one, Dumbledore said. The clerk entered at once with the proper form, cream rather than blue. Extract request, not challenge. Of course. Challenge would have required standing. Extraction required fees and signatures and patience. Legitimacy had a drawer for everything. She set the paper before him with a fresh nib and a bottle of Annex ink. Appraisal columns only, she said. No attached notes, no historical comparators. Of course not, said Dumbledore. He signed with a hand steadier than he felt. 1943. A headmaster inquiry. Withdrawn. He did not yet know whose inquiry, or who had been made to withdraw, or how many children had stood at the edge of this machine while adults had called the arrangement prudent. But he knew, now, that Hogwarts had been used this way before. The Owlery had a way of making every messenger look half guilty before it landed. Wind came through the slits in the stone and worried the straw in the nests, lifting feathers, scraps of parchment, and the odd bit of twine with no business being there. Above, the rafters were full of dusk and the soft, restless clatter of talons on wood. Below, the floor was never clean. There was always a smear by the ledge, always a torn envelope or a broken quill. Hogwarts kept 1,000 things aloft and let the rest fall where they might. Dumbledore stood near the center of the room, with one hand folded behind his back, looking, he suspected, like a patient grandfather waiting for a parcel, which was useful if one had the gift of seeming harmless. Hagrid stood by the wall with his shoulders hunched under the low roof, a bundle of letters crushed to his chest as though they might try to escape. "Stop an owl's biting the postman, that I could do," Hagrid muttered, peering at the latest arrival as it swooped to the top perch. "This lot's different. They come in all together, like a storm." "Storms are rarely polite enough to cue," said Dumbledore. Hagrid snorted, though his eyes stayed on the birds. One tawny owl had landed hard and was already stamping one foot, offended by the world. A screech owl in the corner made a noise like a rusty hinge. Somewhere behind them, a barn owl tore at a ribbon with methodical rage. The first letter Hagrid had intercepted had been from the Ministry. The second bore a family crest. The third, no crest at all, only the school seal and a line in red ink that made the skin at the back of Dumbledore's neck go cold. He had opened none of them yet. Some habits were worth preserving. A sharp flutter from the north window made both men look up. An owl with a thin black ribbon tied to its leg came in low, avoiding the larger birds, and landed on the sill beside a pale gray pigeon that had no business in Hogwarts, but had somehow managed the climb. The ribbon was sealed with plain wax. Not Ministry, not family. A private summons, then, or something pretending to be. Hagrid stared. "That one's got a look on it." "They usually do," said Dumbledore. He took the letter himself, because it was addressed to him in a hand taught to waste no movement. The parchment was thick, expensive, and dry beneath his fingers. The seal bore no crest, only a small, formal mark impressed so deeply it had left the wax almost black. He broke it with his thumbnail. A notice, brief, civil, the sort of civility that had lawyers in its pockets. He read it once, then again, feeling the room narrow around the words. Not a threat, exactly. An invitation, which in some circles was only a threat in better gloves. The sender requested clarification regarding matters brought to attention through recent student inquiry, and required attendance of a representative before the Wizengamot subchamber, by standing. Not a request made to him, in the ordinary sense. A notice that someone else had already decided he would care. He lowered the parchment. "What's that then?" Hagrid asked, trying not to sound as though he were asking. "Bad manners," Dumbledore said, "and a great deal of confidence." Hagrid's brow nodded. He shifted the bundle in his arms. "One of them legal things, is it?" "Yes." "That's no answer," said Hagrid, but without much force. Dumbledore folded the notice and slid it into his sleeve. He would keep that one. Let the sender wonder whether he had seen it. Hagrid tugged one of the other letters free and held it out. "This come on the Thestral route. Bit odd, that." Dumbledore took the envelope and saw at once the family hand upon it. The seal was in dark green wax, stamped with a crest neatly restrained from ostentation by generations of practice. The paper inside was scented with cedar and smoke, the sort of domestic smell that made a thing seem both respectable and cold. He read the first line and felt no surprise at all. That was perhaps the worst part. The writer had heard that questions were being asked. The writer expected the matter to be handled properly. The writer expected discretion. The writer expected compliance. There was no need to say more. Expectation had been doing this work for a very long time. Dumbledore let the parchment rest against his palm. Not a request, then. A shape laid over a child's future and called a courtesy. "Family?" Hagrid said, seeing his face. "Indeed." Hagrid made a noise through his beard. "If that's a parent writin' like that, they can stuff it." "Families are sometimes more persuasive than parents," Dumbledore said, and regretted the gentleness of the words as soon as he heard them. Hagrid blinked at him. "What's that mean?" "It means," said Dumbledore, folding the letter with care, "that some people mistake ownership for concern." "That's a nasty way of putting it." "It is a nasty thing." A high squeal cut across the room. Another owl had come in, this one carrying a narrow strip of parchment tied to its leg with blue thread. It had the look of a note passed from hand to hand before being forced into an owl's keeping for respectability. Dumbledore held out his hand. The bird dropped the strip and hopped back at once, as though even touching it might be catching. The note was short enough to be annoying. It named a Mr. Knott's man, not by title but by function, and asked whether any pupil had sent private post by hand rather than owl. The wording was innocent in the way a trap was innocent until one stepped in it. Dumbledore read it once, then looked at the crowded ledges and the pupils below, invisible to him but present in every frantic wingbeat. Someone was not merely interested in what the students had found. Someone was tracing where their questions had gone, and how. He took a lemon drop from his pocket, not because he wanted one, but because the motion gave his hand something to do. He placed it on the sill for the thin, black-ribboned owl. The bird eyed him with deep suspicion and ate it anyway. "Who's not?" Hagrid asked. "Someone with a family that prefers to ask questions through servants." "That don't sound right." "No." The easy answer would have been to warn the students at once, to sweep them up before the next letter arrived, and tell them to stop being clever in the vicinity of sharks. But the private summons told him they had already been noticed by Standing, and the family letter told him one of them was not merely being watched, but expected. If he showed his hand now, if he spoke too plainly, the compromised child might be forced into a choice before there was anywhere safe to go with it. That would not do. He turned the Knott note over once, as though there might be more on the back. There was not. "Hagrid," he said, "if anyone asks you whether you saw a pupil pass anything by hand, you will say you did not notice." Hagrid frowned hard. "What sort of question's that?" "The sort meant to make people answer too much." "Oh." Hagrid glanced sideways at him. "You want me to lie, then?" "I want you to be forgetful in a most selective manner." Hagrid considered this with the solemnity of a man being asked to misbehave at a funeral. At last he nodded. "Can do that, reckon, though I'd rather bite his nose off." "I should be sorry to lose the nose," said Dumbledore. That got a reluctant grunt from him, almost a laugh. Dumbledore set the Knott note in the inner pocket of his robe, beside the summons. He would answer the tracing effort by muddying the trail before it hardened. The gatekeeper would remember no faces and no parcels unless they came with a school seal. Filch could be induced to discover a sudden concern for unsanctioned corridor traffic in precisely the wrong corridors at precisely the right times. The Owlery records would become just untidy enough to waste a day in counting. And Minerva, without being told more than she needed, could arrange for any student foolish enough to carry private post by hand to be seen doing something else entirely. Not a shield. Not yet. But fog was sometimes better than stone. Another owl landed with a thump, so close that Hagrid stepped back and muttered an apology to it, as if it were a nervous guest. This one carried a ministry tag and a wax seal already cracked from inspection. Dumbledore broke it and skimmed the contents. Routine on the surface, a request for confirmation, a note of interest in school correspondence patterns, the sort of paper that pretended to be paperwork while counting doors and windows. He slipped it into the same pocket. "Is it bad?" Hagrid asked. "Yes." Hagrid looked at the owls, then at him. Bad in the sharp way, or bad in the can-still-be-sorted way? Dumbledore let his fingers rest on the folded family letter. Bad in the way that means someone has decided the children should not remain unseen. Hagrid's face darkened. "Well, that's no good at all." "No," said Dumbledore. He would not call the students in and demand names. Fear made children clumsy, and clumsy children left tracks. He would not send a warning through ordinary channels either. Whoever had thought to ask after hand-carried post would be listening for any sudden change in pattern. Better to move around the edges. Better to make the castle itself seem inattentive while he watched more closely than ever. He drew the family letter out once more and looked at the disciplined hand, the measured pressure of the pen, the confidence that the future could be arranged from a distance if one had enough title and enough nerve. He had seen too many lives narrowed by such confidence, too many children taught to call a cage inheritance. Hagrid watched him in uneasy silence. "Professor?" Dumbledore folded the letter for the last time. "Tonight," he said, "you will tell the gatekeeper that no questions about student post are to be answered without coming through me. Tomorrow, Mr. Filch will discover a passion for inspecting satchels near the front steps. And if any..." Chapter 4. Private Instruments. The subchamber had been built for witches and wizards who preferred their quarrels cooled, indexed, and bound. Beeswax and old parchment thickened the air. A modest fire ticked beneath the mantel, giving off just enough warmth to suggest that the ministry did, on occasion, spend money on comfort, provided the people being comforted already belonged there. Dumbledore sat with his hands loosely folded on the polished table and studied the three committee members opposite. One had a red nose and the look of a man perpetually asked to explain the obvious. Another wore an embroidered collar with family runes worked so discreetly into the hem that the discretion itself had likely been expensive. The third was a gray-haired witch beneath a cap of severe curls, her papers stacked by height with the precision of long habit. Between them lay the extract request, narrow-columned and dry as dust, with its neat notation in black script. Hogwarts linked, student origin, assignable interest. Dumbledore let the phrase sit in the center of the table. "So," he said at last, "the premise is that a child may bind herself at school, under conditions the school neither fully understands nor can safely police, and any resulting obligation may then be treated as a transferable instrument in the ordinary course of commerce." The red-nosed wizard gave a weary shrug. "Only where the instrument has been witnessed, recognized, and indexed. The law is precise." "Yes," said Dumbledore, "that is what alarms me." The gray-haired witch glanced down at her papers. "It is not a question of alarm, headmaster. It is a question of classification. Once the elements are met, the instrument exists. Its value may be appraised. Its control may be assigned. The market does what markets do." On the page, in another hand, someone had written, "Market pressure. Hold until revaluation." The words had the brisk innocence of a shopping list. "And if the promise belongs to a minor?" he asked. "Then the protections apply," she said in the tone of someone reciting a rule to a child already in breach of it. "Permission, witnessing, family standing, the usual safeguards." "The usual safeguards," Dumbledore repeated. The man with the embroidered collar folded his hands over his stomach. With respect, headmaster, you are forcing a modern distress into an old structure. Private allegiance instruments have a long pedigree. They have secured dowries, apprenticeships, warding obligations, family peace accords. The school merely produces some of the younger examples. Because they are younger, said Dumbledore, we are to be less careful with them? We are to be lawful, said the red-nosed wizard, sharper now. If the categories exist, the office cannot pretend otherwise because the matter is untidy. Untidy. A child's loyalty bundled into shares and held until war made it dearer. The word was almost elegant enough to be obscene. Dumbledore lifted the extract request between two fingers. Who first entered the Hogwarts cluster? The stillness that followed was practiced. Not surprise, not guilt. Procedure. The witch's papers gave a faint rustle beneath her hand. That information, she said, is not properly within the scope of this hearing. Then perhaps the scope is too small. It is the only scope you have, said the man with the collar. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You have challenged a classification. You have not been granted standing to audit the register. No, thought Dumbledore. That had been plain from the beginning. One hearing would not unmake a structure that had survived by making itself tedious. Push too hard here and he would only help sharpen its edges, give it the dignity of process. Procedure had a talent for reducing outrage to annotation. He turned his gaze back to the witch. Tell me this much, if you please. Are these Hogwarts-linked matters being brought by one office, or by several? She tapped one finger against the top sheet, a small movement to keep her place. Several. Families? Some? Proxies? Her mouth tightened a degree. Also some. That altered the room. Not one ambitious financier in a warm office, stirring trouble for profit. Not one hand to expose and cut away. A net instead, carefully mended. Respectable surnames at the knots, anonymous clerks at the joins, and the school somewhere in the middle producing raw material without knowing it. The red-nosed wizard cleared his throat. You are overreading it. Am I? The cases are ordinary enough. Warnings, transfers, contests. Wartime has increased volume. That is all. No, thought Dumbledore. War did not create appetite. It merely taught people how little shame they required to feed it. He had seen enough of the last war to know how inventive, respectable men could become when fear promised a return. He set the paper down. If these instruments were intended for family protection and apprenticeship, why does the register permit transfer without informed consent from the maker? Silence held for a beat. Beyond the frosted glass of the door, a clerk's shoes passed briskly over stone and faded. Then the witch said, because the enforceable interest is not the same thing as the spoken words. There it was. Not a flaw in the machine. The machine. Dumbledore watched her face as she spoke. Composed, professional, untroubled by the shape of the answer. She was not confessing. She was instructing him. The regime was always built that way, she continued, perhaps deciding that silence would look weaker than candor. The spoken oath remains with the maker. The recognized interest may be separated, valued, transferred, and called upon by those with lawful title. It allows continuity when families cannot keep their obligations in hand. It was designed to keep promises stable through death, divorce, insolvency, political change. Useful, said Dumbledore. Necessary, she corrected. The word settled between them, neat as a label. So that was the moral of it, if one insisted on having one. The abuse was not some accidental opening discovered by clever predators. It was the old design, functioning exactly as intended, merely under fresh pressure and on cleaner paper. Children, being plentiful and seldom consulted, made excellent collateral. No wonder the market had drifted towards Hogwarts. No wonder it had found willing hands waiting. Dumbledore rested one elbow on the table and looked past them to the narrow window where the London light had gone iron gray. Then, who is coordinating the Hogwarts cases? The man with the collar exchanged a glance with the red-nosed wizard. The witch kept her eyes on her papers. At present, she said carefully, The cluster is routed through a number of established houses and their legal agents. There are family offices in Wiltshire, 2 in Kent, 1 long-standing firm in Edinburgh, and a pair of ministry proxies whose names would tell you little. For the Hogwarts matters specifically, notices are often filed by relatives, godparents, or guardians acting under beneficial control. Dumbledore let the geography settle without asking for names. Kent, Wiltshire, Edinburgh, proxies, beneficial control. The pattern grew clearer and less comforting with every line. Beneficial control, he said. How generous a phrase. It is an accurate one. It is a dreadful one. For the first time, something like sympathy touched her expression, though it may only have been fatigue. Dreadful is not a legal category. No, said Dumbledore. That is part of the trouble. The red-nosed wizard looked at him directly then, and some caution moved behind the official patience in his face. Headmaster, if you mean to suggest collusion, you will need names and standing. I mean, said Dumbledore, that the law has been arranged so the worst part of it may hide in plain sight. No one objected. That silence told its own story. The witch drew a sheet from the middle of her stack and set it aside, as though moving from principle to particular. If you are asking whether there is a single hand behind every Hogwarts-linked matter, the answer is no. There are patterns. Families that prefer the same firms, the same proxies, the same channels. But there is no solitary rogue financier at the center, if that is what you hoped to find. Dumbledore thought of the school. Children crossing flagstones with books under their arms. Owls arriving at dawn with dry, bureaucratic rustles tied to their legs. Promises made in corridors and by sickbeds and in frightened whispers, then weighed elsewhere by people who had never had to make them. A network of respectable hands was worse than a villain. Harder to expose, harder still to stop. Across from him, the committee began to gather its papers with the care of people ending an interview they had not quite lost. The man with the collar slid the extract request back into its file. The red-nosed wizard reached towards the bell pull, then stopped. Your concern for the children is understood, he said. Dumbledore looked at the bell pull, then back at him. Is it? The gray-haired witch closed her top folder. If there is nothing further, Headmaster, we can note your objection to the classification and leave the register as it stands pending any future challenge by a party with standing. Of course, said Dumbledore. She inclined her head once. For a moment he thought the exchange would end there, safely filed under nothing useful at all. Then she laid one hand on the top page as though to turn it and said, There is, however, the matter of whether the cases linked to Hogwarts were first authorized by a family proxy acting for the school or by a house office in Kent, because if that route is confirmed, the next notice will have to be sent to the acting guardian before any call may be perfected. The room did not change. It tightened. Acting guardian, Dumbledore said. For whom? The witch's eyes flicked up to his and away again. For whichever student is named in the next filing. Which student? That, said the man with the collar, is not before this committee. But there is a next filing. No one answered. The red-nosed wizard found the bell pull at last and gave it a short, decisive tug. Somewhere beyond the door, metal rang. You have the substance of our position, Headmaster. Yes, Dumbledore thought. More than you intended. He rose, slow enough to seem unhurried, and gathered neither paper nor file. Let them keep their copies. Let them believe he would say. Chapter 5. The Cost of Rupture. No, said Dumbledore. I have not. You will know before we reach the chapel, and not one moment sooner. The girl took it like a slap and made no pretense otherwise. You expect us to walk into this on your timing? I expect you to remain difficult for another 10 minutes, he said, and alive afterwards. That, at least, checked her. He opened the boathouse door. Evening came in at once, cold off the lake, carrying reed scent and the iron taste of rain. The path up from the water lay in a wash of thinning gold, the stones damp and dark where the spray had reached them. Beyond the trees, the chapel roof showed pale between branches. No one stood outside. Dumbledore listened a moment longer. The ordinary sounds of the grounds had gone oddly selective, as they did when attention was gathering somewhere out of sight. A distant bell from the clock tower, the mutter of leaves, the boat below striking stone again, patient as a creditor. "Now," he said. They did not move. He turned back. The boy still held the letter as though it might bite him again. The girl had folded her arms so tightly it looked painful. "If there is any attempt," Dumbledore said, finishing the warning the moment had cut short in his own mind, "to separate you before we reach the porch, you are not to argue, explain, or be polite. You are to leave. If they tell you delay will worsen the penalty, believe them and leave anyway. A bad position is still preferable to a sealed one." The boy gave a single, strained nod. The girl said, "And the rupture?" There it was. Not refusal, not consent, but the demand that he say plainly what injury he was asking them to carry. "Not here," said Dumbledore, "not in anger, and not with an audience at the door. If it must be declared, it will be declared where the declaration cannot be altered after the fact." Her stare sharpened. "So you do mean to make us do it?" "I mean to prevent someone else doing worse with what is yours." Comforting distinction. "No," he said. "Necessary." For a moment he thought she would stay where she was and force the world to drag her. Then she pushed past him into the evening, looking at neither of them. The boy followed half a heartbeat later, slower, his face set in that rigid way that meant he was holding on by method alone. Dumbledore closed the door behind them. The latch caught with a small, final sound. They took the narrow path up from the shore in single file at first, the girl ahead, Dumbledore behind the boy. The ground was uneven with roots. Twice the boy glanced towards the trees as if expecting someone to step out and name him. No one did. Whoever had arranged the next move was too practiced to waste it on theatrics this early. At the top of the rise, the path widened. The girl stopped without warning, forcing the boy to halt as well. She turned on him then, not dramatically, not loudly. Worse. She had spent the walk deciding what not to say. "When did you know?" she asked. He looked at the letter, then at her. "About the filing? This morning." "That is not what I asked." Dumbledore said nothing. Some wounds had to choose their own blade. The boy swallowed. "I knew there was pressure. I knew my family were speaking to people they should not have been speaking to. I knew they wanted..." He broke off, jaw tightening. "I did not know they had put your name into it." Her expression did not change. "But you knew they might." "Yes." The word landed between them with more force than any denial could have carried. She nodded once, as if confirming an unpleasant sum. "And you came anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" He answered too quickly for invention. "Because if I hadn't, they would have sent someone else." The girl looked away towards the chapel roof. The evening light had gone flatter now, the first true gray moving over the grounds. "That is not better." "No," he said. "I know." Dumbledore watched the knowledge pass through her and settle. Betrayal did not become less betrayal because it had motives attached. The boy knew that too. One could see it in the way he did not reach for excuses. "Walk," said Dumbledore. "You may continue despising one another while in motion." This time the boy nearly laughed, but the sound died before it formed. They went on. The chapel path curved through a stand of yews. Halfway through, Dumbledore saw what he had expected and hoped not to see. A figure crossing ahead at the far end, black robes clipped close, moving towards the side entrance with the brisk discretion of a man who preferred to be thought incidental. The boy saw him too. "Who is that?" "Not the hand," said Dumbledore. "Only a finger." The girl's voice was flat. "You said we'd know before we reached the chapel, and so you shall." They came out from the yews into the open strip of lawn before the chapel wall. The side door stood shut. No light showed beneath it. Good. Better than good. It meant they were not yet late. Dumbledore stopped them with a raised hand. "The filing was lodged through a family office," he said. That much is true and insufficient. The pressure behind it did not begin there. The wording in the annex, the sanctuary forms, the valuation band, those belong to someone who knows both the old ecclesiastical machinery and the newer market instruments, and knows how to make each excuse the other. The boy had gone very still. Who? Dumbledore looked at the chapel, then at the path leading round towards the front. A move like this requires 3 things: money, access, and a conscience already trained to call appetite by a holier name. The girl's eyes narrowed first. She was quicker at pattern than the boy when anger was not in the way. "No," she said. "Yes," said Dumbledore. The boy stared at him. "You can't mean—" "I do." The name needed no ceremony. It arrived in both their faces before either spoke it. "Rosier," said the girl, the word stripped bare. Dumbledore inclined his head once. "Lord Rosier supplied the pressure and the forms. Your family's office supplied the filing, and the invitation to witness the demand under chapel custom was conveyed through a man who owes Rosier 3 favors and calls them principals." The boy went white. "My father—" "Knows enough to be guilty," said Dumbledore. "Not enough to be the architect. Do not waste your hatred by aiming it too low." That struck home. The boy's mouth shut hard. The chapel bell gave one soft note from within, not a summons exactly, but a preparation. Someone was in there. The girl looked from the door to Dumbledore. "So this is the hidden hand." "The first glove over it," he said. "The rest can wait until we are not standing in the open." She drew a breath that shook at the end. "And if Rosier is inside?" "Then you will learn quickly how much of this was built for intimidation and how much for law." "And the rupture?" Dumbledore met her eyes. "If they force the question before we can control the form of it, I will interrupt the proceeding. If I cannot interrupt it, you will say that no declaration has been made. Nothing more. Do you understand me?" The boy answered first. "Yes." The girl waited a beat longer, then nodded. "Good." Dumbledore turned towards the path to the porch. "Stay together. Say little. Let them show their hand before you show your wound." He started forward. After the smallest hesitation, they came with him, side by side now, not from trust, but from necessity. Ahead, the chapel door waited in the deepening dusk, and from somewhere within came the scrape of a chair, the murmur of a voice preparing to be official. The chapel stood at the end of the U-path, its leaded windows dark against the last of the evening, more a family's private sigh than a place of worship. Dumbledore had seen grander sanctuaries, and less honest ones. These stones kept accounts. They remembered who entered under blessing and who under obligation. The door yielded with a dry complaint. Warm air met him first, scented with beeswax and old lilies, and then the chapel proper, narrow, neat, a strip of faded carpet down the aisle, candles guttering low along the walls. At the far end, before the altar, a table had been laid with the care of people determined to call violence by another name. Papers, a brass seal, a shallow bowl of clear water reflecting candlelight in broken knives. A man stood beside the table in a dark traveling coat, one gloved hand resting on the back of a chair, as though he owned both chair and room and would have been offended to prove it. His hair was tidy, his collar immaculate, his expression the practiced mildness of a solicitor or vicar. He had the sort of face that made other people apologize for taking up space. Beside him, Madame L's ledger lay open on its stand. A second clerk hovered near the side pews, with the air of someone paid to witness, not interfere. The student stood at the head of the aisle, the girl rigid, hands folded too tightly, the boy pale, staring at the papers as though they might bite. Dumbledore shut the door behind him. The latch clicked. "Ah," said the man at the table. "Professor Dumbledore, we had hoped you might be reasonable." Dumbledore let his gaze travel over the arrangement once, slowly. The bowl, the seal, the ring of candles, a ritual dressed as administration. The chapel's magic had already warmed to the documents on the table. "Reasonable is an agreeable word," he said. It usually means someone has arrived before the damage is complete. The man's mouth flattened a degree. This proceeding is lawful. Notice has been served, the interest identified, and the beneficiaries are present. There is no need for theatrics.
No, Dumbledore said mildly. Not if one wishes to keep the word for oneself.
He moved close enough to read the top sheet without asking permission. It was neatly typed, heavily stamped, and full of the language that made a rotten thing look properly shelved. Seizure of transferred obligation, beneficial control, wartime consolidation, family sanction. In the middle of the third page, a handwritten note in a sharp, expensive hand. Hold until school term pressure peaks. So, not a rogue clerk with a talent for forgery. Worse, something respectable. The girl saw where his eyes had settled and drew herself straighter. That's him, then? The man answered before Dumbledore could. I am Mr. Rosier's appointed coordinator for this matter. Appointed. Polished until it shone. By whom? Dumbledore asked. By the families whose interests are represented here. Convenient, said Dumbledore, and vague enough to survive a committee. The man's hand flexed once on the chair back, then stilled. Disciplined. Dumbledore had always disliked disciplined men in comfortable rooms. They so often believed themselves the clean edge of filthy work. Madame L. tapped the ledger with one finger. The register confirms the assigned portions. The wartime uplift has been applied. The chapel has accepted the beneficiaries. The chapel. Of course it had. The old magic in the walls had no sentiment about children and little about fairness. It answered to names, seals, sanctioned inheritance, witnessed intent. The chamber itself leaned towards whoever had arrived first, and first, in this case, meant the families who had understood the law long before the students could read it. Accepted, Dumbledore repeated. A comforting word. It suggests the stones have consented. The coordinator gave him a patient smile. The stones are not required to consent. Only the instrument. He touched the top page with one finger. Dumbledore saw then the ring, family crest worked into the gold. Not ministry, not school. Old money, old channels, old confidence. The sort of seal that never needed to raise its voice. You are using wartime valuation to sweep up school oaths, Dumbledore said. House compacts, prefect promises, club commitments, anything that can be made to look enforceable. Then you separate the wording from the collection rights and register the remainder as security. The clerk by the pews made a tiny sound, half cough, half protest. The man in the traveling coat did not blink. Aggregate, he said, not sweep up. School life generates repeated instruments of loyalty. It would be inefficient to treat each in isolation when the law permits beneficial pooling. The boy turned sharply. You said it was to protect people. The man's gaze slid to him with careful civility. It is to protect families from volatility, if you must know. There it was. Not greed alone, though greed had signed enough of the papers. Fear, tidied and framed. Dumbledore had seen enough of that to know it wore decent shoes. He stepped between the students and the table. And who benefits when the protection is called in? The named beneficiaries, the sponsoring houses. In some instances, the school itself, where a bond has been pledged for conduct and quiet. In your two examples, the interests are held on behalf of family-backed oversight until maturity or transfer. The girl gave a short, ugly laugh. Held by who? The coordinator looked almost apologetic. By those with legal title. Her face changed then, not with surprise, but with the jolt of hearing the uglier version spoken aloud. Dumbledore saw the boy glance at her, then away. A small movement. Too late to be harmless. He folded his hands behind his back. You are not merely processing family claims. You are manufacturing pressure from the school into the home and back again, so that no one can say where consent ends. Consent is a generous word for adolescence, said the man. The law is kinder than sentiment. It preserves the bond by assigning stewardship. Stewardship, Dumbledore said softly, is what predators call the cage. For the first time, the man's composure cracked. Not outrage. Calculation. He had not expected challenge in that form. Not from Dumbledore, and not here with witnesses and a ledger already open. Madame L. looked from one to the other. If the bond is destroyed before transfer, the chapel will not recognize the claim. And what, Dumbledore asked, does the rupture cost? No one answered at once. Candlelight shivered over the altar cloth. The boy spoke first, his voice thinned at the edges. You said it would hurt. Yes, Dumbledore said. How much? He looked at the students, both standing too still. There were truths that could be softened only by delay, and delay now would merely serve the papers on the table. Enough to matter, he said. Less than ownership, more than either of you deserves. The girl's clasped hands had gone white at the knuckles. What does that mean? It means, Dumbledore said, keeping his voice level, that a bond made in trust can be broken only by damaging the trust that made it possible. Memory, perhaps. Ease. The certainty that what was shared may be shared again. The loss is not neat. The boy stared at the floorboards. The polished wood held their reflections in dull fragments. He looked too young for any room that carried legal instruments. The coordinator spread one hand. Then you see the position. We may proceed with the transfer, or the bond may be severed and the liability collapse. The family will prefer the former. The girl rounded on him. You mean you'll own us? I mean the market has already priced the obligation, he said. I am here to see that the price is correctly recorded. Market. There, stripped to the bone. So much of the hidden machinery was built from people saying market when they meant children, stewardship when they meant leverage, protection when they meant possession. He had been too late by weeks, perhaps months, and the shame of that sat with him like a stone in his pocket. Still, there was this room, this instant, and the stones had not yet taken the final seal. He looked at the students. If I say stop now, the claim persists. It will wait for another corridor, another office, another family table. If I ask you to break the bond here, in witness, the claim fails. The girl did not look at the man. She looked at the altar, the bowl of water, the papers with their neat little stamps. And afterwards, Dumbledore thought of the boathouse, of words already spoken and not spoken, of the thing that had existed between them before the family names got their hands round it. He thought of what survived a forced severing and what did not. Afterwards, he said, you will still be yourselves, but not as you were this afternoon. The boy's jaw moved once. He had gone still in the way frightened children sometimes did when they had reached the end of hoping an adult would make the choice vanish. Can we choose? Yes, said Dumbledore. The coordinator made a small sound of impatience. This is irregular. Dumbledore glanced at him. Yes, that is one of the advantages of being alive. Then he turned back to the students and lowered his voice. If you mean to do it now. Do not let him write a second line. The girl reached for the boy's hand, hesitated, then took it anyway. The boy closed his fingers round hers with a misery that did not let go. They stood beneath the chapel's narrow windows, two children on the lip of an old machine built by their elders and fed by the school that had failed to see it in time. Say it plainly, the girl said to Dumbledore, though her eyes remained on the bowl. What do we do? You withdraw what was given, he said. Not the words, the permission beneath them. Name the bond as yours and deny its transfer. The chapel will resist. Hold to each other until it stops. The coordinator moved at once. I object. They are minors, and the represented interests— Be quiet, said Dumbledore. It was not loud. It did not still.